adding a sculpted element to your projects really makes them stand out. It gives them that unique appeal that you can call your very own. And sculpting those projects it's a lot of fun because it's really freeing. It allows you to kind of step away from the straight lines and the square edges and kind of give in to wax philosophical, the inner form in the wood. It allows you to play around with shapes and hard lines and soft lines. Now, the elements of coarse, medium, and fine tooling, that principle is no more apparent when it comes to shaping, sculpting, and refining curves. Now, you can use an edge tool like a draw knife or a spoke shave, and these are great because these can handle both the coarse, medium, and fine. You can hog off a whole lot of wood with a draw knife. You can also make fine wispy shavings and a finish-ready surface with the same tool. The spoke shave is, I'd say, more of a medium to fine tool, but regardless, when you're done with the spoke shave, you can leave a finish-ready surface. The problem is with these edge tools, the learning curve is a little bit higher. You have to pay very close attention to the direction of the grain, and that can get even more difficult the more convoluted and more complex the curves and shapes that you create. So one area that really lowers that learning curve is the domain of the rasp. Files and rasps, more specifically when it comes to woodworking, they're ambivalent to grain. You can work against the grain, across the grain, with the grain, whatever, and really just whatever shape is in your head, you can use a rasp to sculpt that. So I want to show you today that coarse, medium, and fine principle, where you can use different grains or coarseness of rasps, follow up with a little bit of files, and if necessary, go to a spoke shave for that final surface, or grab yourself some 220 grit sandpaper. But I think if you have an array of rasps in your shop, sculpture is really the logical step, and I think you'll have a lot of fun with it, adding that individuality and that handcrafted feel to all the projects you make. Now, a lot of you already know that the spoke shave is probably my favorite tool. Heck, it's actually in the logo of my show here. And you can do a lot with a spoke shave. If you look at this piece of walnut, it's got a curve sawn into it. It's actually a cutoff from something else. But following the grain is pretty straightforward on this. You always want to work downhill, and you can see the grain is nice, pleasingly running downhill here. When you come up to the apex and it starts to transition the other way, it gets a little hairy right at the top here, and it can be really difficult in inside corners because how do you get an edge tool in there unless it's something like a draw knife that can go right up into the corners. And if you look, I can shape and refine a surface with it. And that surface I'm creating is nice and polished, and that would be ready for finish. But the uneven cut that's coming off the handsaw here, the turning saw in this case, or even a bandsaw, it's going to chatter all over those little saw marks, and you're ending up spending a lot more time refining this shape and just getting it smooth and getting rid of the tool marks using what should be more of a finishing tool. I can also grab a rasp and I can use it to fair this curve, and I can remove all the little lumps and bumps left by the saw and then come back with a spoke shave as necessary. When I look at this surface now, I can see a little bit of the saw marks right here in the middle, but I'm coming into the same plane, into the same shape. And now when I come back with a spoke shave, you can see how I'm already taking longer shavings here. I'm ending up with a more consistent cut. The more I have to kind of diddle with it, if you will, take short little strokes to clean it up, the less consistent this curve is going to be. I want to be able to take nice long shavings like that. And you can see it's jumping down to the bottom because I haven't used the rasp down there. So already using a coarser tool, and this is the 9-grain RU cabinet maker's rasp. Again, the 9 refers to the coarseness or the fineness of it. 9-grain is about as coarse as you really want to go with woodworking. It's not the absolute though, and if you've got something that's really rough, like this other side here, you can see how the dust is gathering. I've got these big divots and bumps and stuff in here. I could come in with this supposedly coarse tool and clean that up, or I can grab a much bigger, coarser rasp. This is a 6-grain rasp by Liogier company. And it's interesting because it's another French-made rasp company. This is a French-made rasp by RU. RU's kind of become the gold standard in North America anyway for the finest and hand-stitched rasps. Well, I've come to find out there's this other company in France called Liogier that also makes hand-stitched rasps. And as I understand it, in Europe, it actually is considered the gold standard, and RU's kind of the, I don't necessarily want to call them the young kids on the block, because both companies have been around a while. So, obviously this video is kind of sponsored and piped by Liogier because they provided this rasp for me along with this modeler's rasp too. But I have found some real merit to having this really coarse monster of a rasp. You have to be a little careful with a rasp this strong because it removes wood so fast that in some respects you do have to pay attention to the grain a little. If you try to cut against the grain too aggressively, you can end up chipping things out. I also like to take a little bit of blue tape and put it on the end because these teeth are so aggressive they can cut up your fingers pretty heavily. And a rasp is definitely a two-handed tool. But if you look at this surface now, it's been faired. All those lumps and bumps from just kind of rickety sawing are now gone. I could follow it up with this RU 9-grain and refine the surface even more, or I can grab this what is this? This is a 15 or 16 grain. This is a finer modeler's rasp by RU, and I can clean up and kind of refine that surface even more. Now I was working very much along the grain with these rasps, so I've got a pretty clean cut to begin with. But that's nice and smooth already, and I took very little effort with the finer rasp to get there. If I really wanted it to go to like perfect finish ready, I could grab a file now and remove that scratch pattern completely and get it to a nice polished surface. That's pretty close to finish ready there. If it's not, couple of seconds with some 220 grit sandpaper and you're there. Of course, on a curve as straightforward as this little section here, there's no reason why I couldn't come in with an edge tool like this spoke shave and clean up the surface that way. And now that surface is basically reflecting. It's so perfectly smooth. So that's all well and good for a simple curve like that. But what if you actually wanted to add maybe a sculpted edge pattern on here? So I put a couple of layout lines on here. A line down here about 3/4 of an inch in on the face, and a line about 1/4 of an inch from the far side. And I want to connect those with a nice curve. Again, I could start rounding it over with the spoke shave by essentially creating a series of facets and rolling that surface over. And that's fine for a relatively straightforward grain pattern like this. But as you get into this inside corner here, or in this section where the grain transitions from going downhill here to going downhill there, and that little spot in the middle can be really difficult to deal with that. You'll also find that the spoke shave is just, again, being a medium or fine tool, it's going to take a long time to do that. Draw knife could probably make quicker work of it, but the draw knife, I think, has a steeper learning curve, and dealing with changing grain like that can be even more difficult. Now, there are many masters of the draw knife, mostly chair makers, that can work wonders with these things. And believe me, I'm working on this skill, but for now, and for most of us, using a rasp and working through that coarse, medium, and fine regimen will make quick work of this and give you a lot more control. So again, starting with my 6-grain Liogier rasp, I'm going to start rounding this over. I can work directly across the grain, like I'm doing here, or I can kind of skew it and work with the grain. I can get a slightly cleaner cut by working with the grain like this, but I also get a striated cut, if you can see those lines, because the teeth are essentially cutting and pulling up shavings. When I look at the for lack of a better term, the dust on my rasp, I'm getting a lot of shavings rather than dust because I am working with the grain. I can also work against the grain. Now I'm going to get a much rougher cut here because I am causing a little bit of tearing. This is also indicative of a rasp that is this aggressive. I definitely would not go any more aggressive than this, and I wouldn't use a rasp this aggressive unless I had a lot of material to remove. And I've got a fair amount here. But with something this aggressive, I'm also going to want to stay a little bit away from my layout lines. I'll work closer to my layout lines with a finer tool. Okay, that's about as far as I want to go there. So then I'll go to, in this case, what I'm going to consider more of a medium tool. This 9-grain RU could be both your coarse and your medium, but I'll take a lot longer to remove the same amount of material that I just removed with the number 6. But watch now, with this really rough section here, how I can refine this scratch pattern and start to clean the surface up. Think of this in terms of sandpaper. You leave a deeper scratch pattern with 80 grit paper, and then you switch to 120 or something like that and leave a finer scratch pattern. But just like with sandpaper, I wouldn't want to start with 220 grit and expect it to do all the work for me. That would take a really long time. That's looking a lot better right there. Here, back here, you can see that really coarse stuff from the 6-grain Liogier. Now I've got this finer pattern from the 9-grain RU. Now I'm going to come back with my fine modeler's rasp. And I'm going to get very close to my finished surface here. And this is not going to be as apparent as the 9-grain. Visually, I can see to the naked eye it looks a lot cleaner. The real test is in the feel. There's a definite difference between the 9-grain surface and this 15-grain surface. This feels glass smooth, and you can probably see a little bit of the reflection that you're getting here. As I said, I could actually go one step further and grab a file and refine this even more. And I can work really whichever way I want, with, against, cross the grain, whatever stroke I have to take to create the shape that I'm looking for. And now, I think that is finished ready. I mean, that is as smooth as any smoothing plane could make it. If I look real close, I don't see any scratch pattern left on here. That is ready to have finish applied to it. If you weren't certain, again, you could grab, probably, I wouldn't touch this with anything less than 320 or 400 grit sandpaper. But you can see coarse with the 6-grain Liogier rasp, medium with the 9-grain RU rasp, fine created by the 15-grain modeler's rasp, and a little bit of work with a Nicholson file. And I have a nice sculpted curve here, and didn't take very long at all because I used that coarse, medium, and fine principle. Now I want to say a little bit about the differences in rasps. I'm fortunate. I've got some very nice rasps here in the shop. My Liogier and my RU are, frankly, if you wanted a review of sorts, these perform exactly the same. I'm actually a little bit more partial to the Liogier rasp because they have a much wider range of shapes available, and they've got a couple of different steels. This is I guess you would call this more of the everyday steel. They have another one that I believe is called sapphire that's even harder and will last even longer. Frankly, for the average woodworker, I don't think that's not quite necessary. But they've got some really thin tapered rasp. This curved modelless rasp is a really cool tool to work with for unusual shapes and inside curves and things like that. This is a 12 grain, so it's not quite as fine as this RU modeler's, but it's definitely finer than this cabinet maker's 9 grain. So Liogier, I think, offers a much wider range of profiles. Still the same grain, coarseness to fineness that you can get with RU. But again, it's really cool that we've got those options, and we've got those options, frankly, all over the world. Since they're made in Europe and they're now being distributed in North America, you can get either RU or Liogier. But the key difference that you hear people talking about all the time is the difference between a hand-stitched rasp, where the teeth are kind of more randomly spaced and they run all the way to the edge and all the way to the point, and a machine-stitched rasp like this Nicholson, what is this, 49? Yeah, number 49 cabinet maker's rasp. The teeth are machined here, they're all lined up in rows, they don't run all the way to the edge, and it doesn't come to a point. So I don't have quite as much flexibility, but for the shaping I just did, I didn't need that kind of flexibility. But I want to show you a little bit of how these work. I don't know if you can hear that difference, but it's a much more aggressive kind of grating sound that's coming from this Nicholson. It's removing wood, but it's leaving a much rougher surface than even this 6 grain Liogier. I'm also having to work a lot harder. Because the teeth are all lined up in rows like this, it tends to plow grooves, and it makes it work a lot harder than essentially this 9 grain should be about equivalent in coarseness of cut. When I use that, it starts really easily. Hear how much quieter that is? Think of this in terms of chatter on a blade. When a blade chatters, it makes a lot more noise. When it cuts cleanly, it makes kind of a whispering sound. This is the whisper equivalent on a rasp. And I have a much, much, much cleaner surface there. So maybe it's a minor distinction between machine stitched and hand stitched, and definitely you're looking at a major cost difference. You know, this Nicholson rasp is going to run you about $45 to $50. This guy is going to run you $109. This beast of a Liogier rasp, I want to say, is $110. It's little apples and oranges because it's a much bigger and coarser grain tool. But it's safe to say that a hand-stitched rasp is going to be twice that of a machine-stitched rasp like a Nicholson, a well-made machine-stitched rasp. There are certainly cheaper rasps out there. I think if you're going to do finer work and you're going to do a lot of work, you'll appreciate the ease of use of a hand-stitched rasp. You're going to appreciate that it cuts just as aggressively, but it cuts and leaves a cleaner surface with a lot less effort. So, you know, it's a personal choice. Certainly it's a choice based upon, you know, what's in your bank account too. But it is something that it's hard to tell the difference until you've tried one or the other. It's an immediate difference in use between these two. I can feel it immediately. You certainly can hear it immediately, and I can see the difference immediately. So that really just barely scratches the surface of what you can do with files and rasps, and, you know, kind of scratches the surface of the difference between machine and hand stitched. Hopefully, like me, you will have been exposed to a new company, Liogier rasp, that I knew nothing about and have become very impressed with. And for that question, because it seems RU is so well known here in North America, you can feel safe that it's the same quality between those two. It's just a different French manufacturer. And frankly, I'm really quite happy with the selection they've offered. I want to thank Noel Liogier for supplying this 6-grain rasp to me to allow me to try it out and really test for myself what I'll say is almost the lack of difference between the two of them. And believe me, that's not a backhanded compliment. I have nothing but the highest regard for RU rasps, and now I can put Liogier in the same bucket. So, you know, there's my plug, since I'm officially calling them sponsors of this. But hopefully you learned a little bit about how you can incorporate rasps into your shop, how you can lower that learning curve for shaping curves when maybe previously you thought you could only use a spoke shave and struggle with the spoke shave, or used a draw knife and really struggled with that. Adding rasps will open up the whole ability to sculpt your projects, furniture, boxes, whatever. So get yourself some rasps and start rasping. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time.